They laughed when I moved into the attic like I was some old ghost taking up space. What they didn't know was the house was mine, and so was the final say. This is the story of how I turned silence into power and locked the door on their entitlement. What happened next will shock you. But before we continue, hit that subscribe button for more stories like this. I moved into the attic, not because it was charming or cozy, but because there was nowhere else to go in the house I had owned for over 40 years. My name is Winona. I am 72 years old, and the day my son and his family moved in, I thought I was helping. Their house had flooded. Their insurance was dragging its feet, and I offered what any mother would offer shelter: a warm meal, a roof built from decades of sacrifice. At first, they were grateful, full of pleases and thank yous, and exaggerated politeness. Then the gratitude turned into assumptions. My daughter-in-law started rearranging furniture like it was hers to move, placing vases in odd corners and muttering about the house needing a modern touch. The grandchildren, once sweet, began ignoring me, stomping past with headphones in and attitude trailing behind them like smoke. One afternoon, I found my sewing machine unplugged and shoved into a closet, the table replaced by a playpen. They told me I should take the attic, that it was quieter up there, better for my back, closer to peace and far from their mess. They called it temporary, but nothing about it felt short-term when they took my bedroom and my space without a second thought. I stood in that attic doorway, staring at the dust-speckled light filtering through a single window, and said nothing. I didn't argue, I didn't protest. I just nodded, carried my boxes up one at a time, and tried not to let the sound of my knees cracking drown out my dignity. The attic was once a place I stored old Christmas decorations and forgotten suitcases. Now it held me mattress on the floor, a lamp with a crooked shade, and the quilt I had stitched with arthritic fingers folded like a relic no one wanted to look at. Every night I listened to the muffled sounds below, the clink of wine glasses, laughter that never included me, and footsteps that never climbed to check if I needed anything. They forgot I was still in the house. Or maybe they remembered and just didn't care. I sat on that mattress, staring at insulation nails and spider webs, and realized I had become a guest in the home I built with my hands. A ghost with laundry privileges. But I wasn't angry. Not yet. Not then. That came later. Right after the smirk. I heard it through the vents. The way all things are heard when you are above everyone but matter less than anyone. The laughter started soft, like wind rustling paper, until it turned sharp and clear as glass. My grandchildren, sitting around the kitchen island I once scrubbed down with lemon oil and elbow grease, were giggling about me. About Grandma. They said I was like Rapunzel in the attic, except without the hair, just stuck up there with my knitting and my dusty books. I paused mid-stitch, the needle trembling between my fingers. Not because I was surprised, but because I was stunned by how familiar their cruelty sounded. It was the kind of laughter that made no room for guilt, only performance. My son did not stop them. He laughed too, louder than the rest, as if to prove something to someone I would never meet. My daughter-in-law chimed in, her voice syrupy and cruel, saying I liked it up there because I was always nesting, like a little bird who didn't want company. I stared at the vent grill, the metal rusted at the corners, and tried to remember the last time I had laughed in this house. Real laughter. The kind that comes from the belly and shakes loose the dust on your bones. It had been years, maybe longer. I used to be the center of this family, the one who made birthday cakes from scratch, the one who held hands in waiting rooms, who stayed up folding laundry and wiping tears and covering rent when no one else could. Now I was a joke upstairs, the woman in the ceiling who kept quiet and didn't get in the way. A relic, they called me, though not out loud, just through the way they spoke over me. The way they never waited for me to join them before starting dinner. The way they left me out of group texts and vacation plans and family photos. I sat on the edge of my bed, the one I had moved up there myself, listening as they clinked glasses and peeled oranges and filled the silence with everything but me. I realized, then they no longer saw me as a person. I was an afterthought, with a pulse. A maid with no paycheck. A memory they refused to admit was still alive. And the worst part was how natural it sounded in their voices. Like this was always the plan. Like I had agreed to disappear. It started with a box labelled winter coats that had nothing but my wedding veil inside. Yellowed and folded like a memory trying to stay relevant. The attic was hot that afternoon. Dust motes hanging in the sunbeam like ghosts waiting to be noticed. And I sat cross-legged on the wooden floor sorting through bins I hadn't opened in years. I found letters from my husband, faded from time and thumbed soft from all the times I had reread them, each word carrying the weight of a different life, a life where I was held like something precious. I found recipe cards in my mother's handwriting, crooked and smudged, written on napkins, old receipts, the backs of envelopes, all once tucked into drawers that no longer remembered me. There was a card from my son when he was 7 that read, "To the best mom in the world," written in crayon, framed in glitter glue, and I held it like a fragile piece of truth, wondering where that little boy had gone. As I flipped through albums and clipped newspaper announcements, I started to realize something I hadn't allowed myself to admit until that very moment. I had built this house with love, brick by brick, memory by memory. I had picked out the curtains, sanded the banisters, planted the lilacs that still bloom every spring like clockwork. I had rocked my baby boy to sleep in the corner room before he ever said his first word, before he grew into a man who would laugh behind my back and hand me a room under the roof like a forgotten suitcase. I had stitched this home together, with sacrifices, with late nights and early mornings, with a kind of love that didn't keep receipts but certainly deserved more than dust and distance. Yet somewhere along the line, I had become background noise in my own story. I was the wallpaper. No one noticed, unless it started peeling. I was the hands behind the meals, the laundry, the mortgage checks, never the face in the picture. I looked around that attic, surrounded by the proof of everything I had given, and I felt it deep in my bones, the ache of being erased, slowly, politely, and completely. And in that silence, in that stale, forgotten air, I stopped crying. I stopped hoping they would change. And I started planning. Not for revenge, but for reclamation. Because I was still here. And I remembered everything. The drawer stuck at first like it had grown stubborn with time, but I yanked gently until it gave way. And there it was, tucked behind some faded stamps and a rusted letter opener, the deed to the house. My name, clear as a bell, printed in black ink that hadn't faded despite the decades. Winona May Griffin, sole owner, no co-signer, no joint ownership, no names added beneath mine. I stared at it like I was meeting an old friend who had never stopped believing in me. My husband had made sure of it, long before he passed, telling me once over coffee that if anything ever happened, this house would always be mine. I had forgotten that part, buried it under years of holiday dinners and birthday candles and the sounds of other people's needs. But here was the proof, legal and binding, that I was not a guest in my own home, not a tenant renting space in the attic from a family who thought I was an obligation. I ran my fingers over the raised seal, feeling something stir in my chest that I had not felt in a long time. Ownership. Not just of property, but of self, of story, of spine. I didn't make a scene. I didn't slam doors or cry or storm down the stairs with righteous fury. Instead, I slipped the deed into a manila folder, snapped it shut, and walked downstairs like a ghost, unseen and silent. In the kitchen, My daughter-in-law was arguing over avocado toast with one of the children. My son was in the den, with the television too loud. No one looked up. I grabbed the phone from its cradle, took it back upstairs, and made a single call. My lawyer still had the same number after all these years. And when she picked up and recognized my voice, she said, "Well now, this is a surprise." I told her I had something important to bring in, something personal, not urgent, but soon. She said, "Come by Tuesday." I hung up, folded the deed into my lap, and stared out the attic window at the sycamore tree in the yard, the same one my son used to climb when he was small and fearless and still thought, I hung the moon. I had thought finding the deed would hurt. Instead, it felt like a door unlocking inside me. Slowly, surely, waiting for my hand on the knob. And this time, I would be the one deciding who walked through it. My lawyer smiled when I showed her the deed, the same way a doctor smiles when they know the surgery will be simple and clean. She told me it would be easy, almost too easy. And I nodded as she explained the details. One signature, notarized and sealed, and the house would be placed into a living trust with me as the sole trustee. No loopholes, no disputes, no need for explanations to anyone who had laughed while I climbed stairs with aching knees. I sat in her office, sipping coffee from a paper cup while she printed the forms. I signed them without hesitation, steady hand, no second thoughts. I walked out of there not just as a woman with a legal document, but as someone who had taken back the narrative that had been rewritten around her for far too long. When I got home, no one noticed I had been gone. My son was on a conference call, pacing in socks with holes. My daughter-in-law was arguing with customer service over a throw pillow. The children were fighting over Wi-Fi. I walked past them all, a quiet ghost carrying a purse with the power of a thunderstorm tucked inside. At dinner that night, I ladled gravy over dry turkey and passed the salt without a single word about what I had done. I smiled when they asked me to refill their drinks. I wiped crumbs off the counter while they talked about vacation plans I wasn't invited to. Underneath my pillow in the attic, nestled beside an old photo of my wedding day, I placed the trust documents in a folder marked quilting patterns. No one ever checked there. They thought my things were clutter, sentimental junk, and that was fine with me. The attic became more than a prison after that. It became a fortress, a waiting room for justice. I didn't change how I acted. I still said goodnight. I still folded their towels and left mints on the guest pillows out of habit. But everything was different now, because the house no longer belonged to the woman in the attic. It belonged to the woman who owned the locks, the land, the silence, and the final say. And as I lay down that night, the hum of the ceiling fan above and the distant echo of laughter below no longer pierced me. They only reminded me that the most powerful moves are made in silence. They left on a Friday morning with the usual chaos, shouting about chargers and car snacks and whether the GPS needed updating. I stood in the doorway, clutching a dish towel, watching my son kiss his wife on the forehead while she barked at the kids to hurry up. He said, "Back Sunday night," like I was the maid being given instructions. They didn't ask if I needed anything while they were gone. No one wondered if I was well. As soon as the car disappeared down the street, I stood for a moment in the hush they left behind. It was the first real silence I had felt in months. I locked the front door behind me, slid the chain into place, and opened the folder from under my pillow. The locksmith came at noon, a young man with kind eyes and no questions. He changed every lock on every door while I made tea and sliced lemon bread. I watched him work, his tools clicking like tiny hammers of fate, sealing me in and them out. I even replaced the keypad code on the garage. I made sure the cameras faced outwards, not inwards. When he left, I stood in the middle of the living room, and breathed. Not shallow attic air, but deep, grounded air that smelled like hardwood and lavender. I spent the weekend reclaiming each room. I opened windows wide. I washed every sheet. I donated their clutter. I found my favorite vase, the one they had shoved behind their Vitamix, and filled it with peonies. I rearranged the photos, placing my wedding portrait back on the mantel where their vacation selfies used to sit. I made soup and played my old records and took a bath in the master tub that was supposed to be mine. And when Sunday came, right on time, I saw their car slow to a crawl in front of the driveway. They looked confused, then irritated. My daughter-in-law reached for her phone. My son knocked. I didn't answer. The lights were off, but I was home. I watched them from the guest bedroom window, the one that faced the porch. They rang the bell again. The children started to whine. I didn't wave. I didn't speak. I let the silence answer for me. Because sometimes the only way to teach people what home means is to remind them whose name is still on the deed. They knocked first like it was still their house, bold and casual, as if the locks were a misunderstanding and the door would open the moment they demanded it. Then came the pleading, soft voices calling through the door like I was some fragile elder having a moment, not a woman making a decision. My son said my name like it had power over me. My daughter-in-law said they were just joking, that the whole attic thing had been playful, that the kids didn't mean any harm. But I remembered the sound of their laughter floating through the vents while I folded my clothes on a mattress pushed up against a window that rattled in the wind. I remembered the way no one corrected the children when they called me a witch or a ghost or said I liked being alone. They made me a relic, then laughed when I gathered dust. That kind of laughter is not innocent. It is sharp and pointed and meant to pierce the softest parts of you. I stood behind the curtain, watching their faces twist between frustration and confusion, the kind that comes when people realize they've lost something they thought was guaranteed. They shouted that they needed to get inside, that the kids were hungry, that this wasn't funny anymore. But I wasn't laughing. I wasn't crying either. I felt still in a way I hadn't in years. My phone rang, then rang again. I let it ring. I let the knocks turn into silence. I let them feel the echo of every time I asked for a moment of help and got brushed aside. I walked from the window, my slippers whispering across the floor I had mopped that morning, the one they always left sticky with juice or muddy shoes. I made myself a cup of tea, the kind I liked, not the kind I was expected to make for everyone else. Chamomile with a touch of honey. I sat at the kitchen table, the same one they used to pile with Amazon boxes and unopened mail, and I stared at the light streaming through the window. The knocking continued for a while, then stopped. I imagined them backing away, unsure what had changed or when exactly they lost control of the story. But it was never their story to own. It was mine. And now, for the first time in a long while, I was writing it myself. When the Hendersons let themselves in with the spare key I had left tucked inside the old flower pot, they carried with them a bag of groceries and the assumption that they were about to water plants and feed the cat for a week. Instead, they stepped into a home that smelled like warm cinnamon and fresh sheets. I was in the master bedroom, reclined in the armchair I hadn't sat in for years. The sunlight pooling around my feet, my tea steeping gently on the side table. I looked up and smiled, as if nothing about the world had shifted, as if I hadn't just redrawn the map of my own life with a pen stroke and a locksmith. Their surprise was unfiltered, sweet in a way that made me chuckle. Mr. Henderson said my name like a question, then trailed off when he saw the calm in my expression. I invited them in, offered them a seat, poured a second cup. I told them everything. About the attic. About the way I had become a guest in my own home. About the jokes that weren't jokes, and the way dignity withers in silence. I watched their faces shift as the story settled in. No pity, no awkward sympathy. Just a growing light in their eyes that looked a lot like respect. Mrs. Henderson reached across the table and placed her hand on mine. "Good," she said, not needing to say anything more. That single word wrapped around me like a blanket, warm and affirming. They stayed for a while, longer than planned, helping me bring down the last of my quilts and the framed photos I had packed away out of embarrassment. We stood in the hallway as I pointed out the repairs I wanted to make now that the house was truly mine again. I spoke not with bitterness but with purpose, as though I had reawakened something in the walls that only I could tend to. Before they left, Mr. Henderson looked back at me and said, "You don't owe anyone an explanation, Winona, but I'm glad you told us anyway." After they were gone, I sat alone again, in the room where I once sang lullabies to my son, where I had read novels by lamplight and traced the outlines of my life through shadows on the ceiling. It felt like mine again. Not a museum of sacrifice, but a home with the door finally shut to those who never deserved a key. The group chat buzzed for days like a wasp nest poked with a stick, all caps and exclamation marks and feigned concern wrapped in digital politeness. My niece messaged first with a passive-aggressive, "Hey auntie, just checking in, everything okay?" followed by a string of confused emojis. Then came my cousin Loretta with a vague, "Heard some chatter. Hope it's not true," which only confirmed that my son had spread the story of the attic mutiny like wildfire. My sister-in-law, always the self-appointed mediator of other people's drama, finally picked up the phone and called. Her voice was syrupy at first, but I could hear the edge beneath it, the same edge she used when telling me to bring store-bought pies instead of homemade ones to Thanksgiving. "Winona," she said, like I had committed a crime against nature. "What are you doing?" I looked out the window at the roses I had planted when I was newly married, blooming wild and unbothered, and said without apology, "Living in my own home." There was a silence then, not the kind that invited conversation, but the kind that confirmed everything I had long suspected, that for years they had treated my kindness as weakness and my patience as something they were entitled to. The messages kept coming in like little jabs, trying to shame me back into submission. One cousin said, "Family is all we have." Another asked if I was okay in the head. I didn't respond to those. I had no desire to argue with people who saw my boundaries as betrayal. I made tea instead, sat in my chair with the sun on my face, and watched the robins dive into the bird bath like they didn't owe anyone explanations either. The attic door remained locked. Not because I was hiding, but because it symbolized what I had left behind. I let them spin their stories and share their shocked opinions, because none of it could change the fact that this house, every shingle and step and creaky floorboard, was mine. And now, so was the silence. Not the kind I had been forced into, but the kind I had chosen, the kind that echoed back dignity. When another text pinged in, asking if I planned to make amends, I simply deleted the message and returned to my cup of tea. The storm outside their screens had nothing to do with me anymore. I was home. It started with a blurry photo someone must have taken of me through their car window, walking down the drive in my floral robe, clutching the morning paper like a scepter. The caption read, "Elderly woman locks out family after living in attic." At first I laughed. A dry, surprised laugh. The kind you let out when someone catches the truth and dresses it in tabloid lace. But then it spread. Not viral in the way young people hope for, but like a whisper passed between pews, grocery aisles, and bridge clubs. Mrs. Hammond from 2 streets over left a covered dish on my porch. No note, just pot roast and understanding. A young woman I didn't know knocked and asked gently if I was the one from the post, said she wished her own grandmother had done the same before being pushed into assisted living. I didn't answer, just offered her a seat on the porch swing and 2 cups of lemonade. Online, the comments poured in, some full of judgment, others of admiration. She finally stood up for herself. One read, "Family doesn't mean you get to treat someone like furniture." Another accused me of being heartless, of turning my back on tradition and unity. But tradition, I thought, should not come with eviction notices written in laughter and passive neglect. Reporters never came, but the story bloomed quietly in corners of the internet where women whispered their own attic stories. I received a letter in the mail, an actual letter from a woman in Minnesota who said she too had been laughed out of her own kitchen by a daughter-in-law with designer opinions and no recipes of her own. She said she had read about me and cried. I wrote her back. Just a line. "You are not crazy for wanting space to be yours." The post wasn't about me anymore. It was about every woman who had handed over keys too soon and then been asked to disappear. My face became a symbol not of rebellion, but of return. The attic may have been quiet, but this was the sound of stories waking up. And while it wasn't a headline, it was enough. Enough to remind me that silence, when broken on your own terms, echoes wider than any scream. I sat on my porch each morning after that, paper in hand, tea on the table, and let the breeze carry the story wherever it needed to go. The garden had been theirs for a while, or so it felt. My daughter-in-law had called it extra work, and let the weeds make their home where tomatoes once grew, and my son only ever passed through it on his way to the grill. But now it was mine again, every inch of soil humming with the memory of who I used to be before I let myself be tucked into the corners of my own life. I began each morning with gloves and a spade, a battered straw hat over my greying curls, and no one to interrupt me or sigh dramatically from the back patio. I uprooted dandelions like they were doubts. I trimmed the hedge that had leaned like a tired shoulder against the fence, coaxed it back into shape with gentle snips and murmurs. I dug new beds for lavender along the porch where bees came to bless me for the invitation. The roses, long neglected and leggy, began to bloom again, like they too had been waiting for the silence to end. I spoke to them as I watered, not in madness but in memory, calling them by the names my husband once teased me for giving them: Mabel, June, Doris, each bush, a woman who had outlasted storms. I planted herbs in neat rows and tied ribbons around the fence posts, soft blue ones that fluttered like quiet joy. I was not trying to prove anything. I was not creating an Instagram-worthy scene. I was simply restoring what had been mine, long before the attic, before the jokes, before the slow erasure disguised as practicality. Neighbours passed by and waved more often now. One brought over spare seeds. Another asked if I had any cuttings to share. I found myself smiling at their footsteps instead of flinching. The sun felt different when it hit your own hands, when you were not hidden away in someone else's hierarchy. In the garden, I was not someone's burden. I was not inconvenient. I was not a relic tucked into the rafters. I was a woman with dirt under her nails and intention in her bones. The garden flourished as if it had been holding its breath with me, waiting for this moment of return. And with every bloom that opened, with every petal that turned toward the sky, I remembered who I was, not just the woman in the attic, but the woman who planted the whole damn house around herself, one rose at a time. The letter was printed on thick cream stock, crisp and unbending, the kind of paper that made people pay attention before they even read the first line. My lawyer had drafted it with precision, every word carrying the weight of quiet finality. No pleasantries, no emotion, just the legal truth delivered with all the cold grace they once offered me when they handed me boxes to organize my attic space. The envelope had their names printed clearly across the front, no room for confusion or assumption. It arrived midweek, when they were least expecting it, tucked among the bills and discount flyers, an uninvited guest with perfect posture. They had 2 weeks, 14 days to retrieve their shoes piled in the foyer, their boxes of decorations marked seasonal, the spare stroller left abandoned in my sunroom. Everything had to be removed, or it would be donated to the community centre down the street. Not stored, not held for safekeeping, not gently returned. Donated. Given to someone who might treat things with care instead of entitlement. I did not include a handwritten note. I did not send a text to warn them. I did not explain or apologize. Because for years I had bent to avoid being the difficult one, the emotional one, the bitter old woman who just needed to be managed. I had spent holidays biting my tongue while they talked over me, watched them remodel my traditions as if I were a ghost watching from the ceiling fan. But this letter was not about anger. It was about boundaries written in ink. My lawyer called it a final notice. And I liked the sound of that. Final. Notice. I imagined their faces when they opened it. The daughter-in-law, with her perfectly painted nails gripping the edge a little too tight. My son pacing, insisting it must be a misunderstanding, that I couldn't possibly mean it. But I did. The house was mine. The attic was empty. The door was locked. The garden was blooming. And now, the rest of the clutter, their clutter would follow. I folded a copy for myself and slid it into the folder, with the deed, the trust papers, the receipts for the new locks. It felt like placing a period at the end of a sentence that had gone on too long. I poured a cup of tea and waited for the silence that would follow, the kind that arrives when people finally realize you are not bluffing. The attic used to echo with creaks and dust, a place where boxes went to be forgotten, where old Christmas lights tangled like regrets and forgotten photo albums curled at the corners, quietly decaying. But I decided that if this space was once where they thought I belonged, I would make it mine on my own terms. I opened the window and let the air roll through like a tide, clearing the stale hush that had settled in my absence. I painted the walls a soft cream that caught the light in a way that made even the slanted ceiling feel like a chapel. I scrubbed the floorboards until they no longer creaked, but sang with each step. Then laid down the old rug from my first apartment, the one I had nearly given away before remembering it still had stories left in it. I brought up the record player from the hall closet and stacked my favorite vinyl beside it, albums I hadn't played in years because no one ever asked what music I loved. I hung lace curtains over the tiny arched window, letting them billow in the breeze like delicate sails on a ship finally setting course. I moved in a velvet armchair and a lamp with a stained glass shade that cast kaleidoscopes on the ceiling at night. I placed a tray by the window with my tea set, the one I used to bring out for guests before I became the guest in my own home. I tacked a photo of my late husband to the wall, not in mourning but in memory, because he would have loved this space, would have danced with me to Ella Fitzgerald under the beams. Slowly, the attic stopped being a place I was exiled to and started becoming something else entirely. A retreat. A reclaiming. A room with no shame, no laughter echoing from vents below, no conversations that excluded me while happening in my kitchen. I wrote letters up there. Real ones. With ink and intention. I read poetry aloud to myself. I even cried once, not from sadness but relief, like I had been holding my breath for years. The attic was no longer a punishment. It was a sanctuary, a space carved out in the rafters of my own resilience. And every time I opened the door to that room, I felt taller. Not because the ceiling had changed, but because I had. They started coming in 2s and 3s. The kind of friends who remembered when my hands were steady enough to pipe icing roses onto a birthday cake, or when my front porch was the neighborhood's unofficial complaint box and blessing bench. They brought homemade jam, newspaper clippings, and one even brought a dog that immediately curled at my feet, like it had always known me. I brewed Earl Grey in the teapot with the chipped lid, the one that had survived 5 moves and more stories than I could count. We sat around the kitchen table, the good one with the worn edges and faint burn mark from when I tried to flambe in the 70s. We talked about hips that creaked louder than the floorboards, about how the butcher's prices were highway robbery, and how the world had started spinning too fast, but tea still slowed it down. Someone brought up the story going around town, how the attic woman had taken back her house, and we all laughed until our cheeks ached because they knew the woman behind the story, and I was no myth. One of them, Marnie, who I had once helped through a divorce with nothing but soup and silence, leaned forward and said, "You look different, Winona. Taller." And I didn't laugh. I looked her right in the eye and said, "That's what standing up for yourself does." It wasn't just a line, it was the truth, carved into my spine like it had been waiting to be spoken. I had spent so long folding myself to make room for others that I forgot what it felt like to sit fully upright in my own name. Now, every time someone rang the doorbell and I opened it on my terms, with my keys in my pocket and my chin held high, I felt the house lean in with me, like it finally recognized its owner again. These weren't pity visits. These were reconnections, reminders that I still mattered, that my stories still had punchlines, that I was more than a quiet woman in an attic. We traded secrets and knitting patterns like contraband, and for the first time in years, the laughter that filled my home didn't sting. It soothed. It stitched. It settled into the walls like it belonged there, just like I did. This was not a chapter I was lucky to have. This was a chapter I wrote myself, tea-stained and unapologetic. Now, the house feels like mine again in a way it hadn't for years, not even before they moved in with their suitcases full of entitlement and their whispered jokes under breath. Every creaking floorboard greets me like an old friend, and every speck of dust feels like a memory I'm no longer afraid to carry. I walk barefoot in the kitchen now, letting the cold tiles wake me up better than coffee ever could. And I leave the door open while I sip my tea, letting the breeze carry in sounds of the street and birds and anything but guilt. No one watches me anymore from the corner of their eye, waiting for me to say something outdated or embarrassing. I play records in the middle of the day, dance when I feel like it, and sleep in the master bedroom, in the attic, even on the couch when the mood suits me. There is no assigned corner for me here, no space where I am folded small to make someone else comfortable. The attic I was once shoved into now holds my artwork, my books, and a sunlit chair I dragged up there with purpose. I even found my husband's old sweater in the hall closet, the one he wore when he planted those roses, and I hung it over the banister like a flag. This house remembers me now, every corner lined with my choices instead of compromise. There are fresh flowers on the dining table again, ones I picked myself, not a gift from someone trying to soothe guilt with stems. When people visit, they knock, and when they ask to come in, it is me who decides. And if one day, someone who wasn't there for the dust and the disrespect dares to ask why I changed the locks or why I didn't forgive more quickly or why I drew such a firm line between love and tolerance, I will just sip my tea and look them in the eye. Because sometimes, when people forget who built the home, who stitched the curtains and patched the roof and filled the fridge when no one else thought to, you remind them, not by shouting, not by begging, but by reclaiming the key, quietly, permanently. And once it's back in your hand, you don't give it up again. Not unless it's to someone who sees you as the foundation, not the furniture.